The coffee had gone cold again. Jonas Reed noticed it the way he noticed most things these days, quietly, without surprise, the way a man notices weather or the slow lean of a fence post he has been meaning to fix for 3 seasons. He wrapped both hands around the tin cup anyway, not for warmth, just for something to hold. The sun was still low over the eastern ridge, the kind of pale Kansas morning that hadn't yet decided what it wanted to be. The grass across the Cimarron bottomland was silver with dew, the cottonwoods along the creek standing dark and motionless, and somewhere past the low roll of the second hill, past the line of rusted wire and cedar posts that marked the edge of Jonas's property. The Voss place sat quiet in the early light. It had been quiet for about 4 minutes. Before that, it hadn't been. Jonas had heard the shouting the way he had heard it before, which was clearly because sound carried far over flat Kansas land, and there was nothing between the two properties to soften it. A man's voice clipped and hard. A younger man's voice underneath that, angrier, less controlled. And once briefly a sound that was not a voice at all, but something closer to a cry, the kind a person makes when they understand that words are no longer going to help them. Jonas set the cup down on the rail. He looked across the pasture toward the Voss land for a long moment. The dew on the grass, the motionless trees, the sky turning from gray to something almost gold at the edges, the way Kansas mornings did in late September when the season was starting to let go. Then he picked the cup back up, turned around, and walked inside. He stood at the kitchen window and drank the cold coffee and did not look out again. This was not the first time. That was the part Jonas Reed had stopped trying to make himself forget, because forgetting was a young man's luxury, and Jonas was 56 years old, and understood that certain things did not leave a man's memory regardless of how much distance he put between himself and the moment. They just settled deeper. They found the floor, and they stayed there, and on some mornings like this one, you could feel them pressing up through the boards under your boots. He rinsed the cup at the basin, dried it with the cloth hanging from the nail beside the window, set it back on the shelf exactly where it lived. The shouting had stopped. The morning had gone quiet again across the Cimarron bottomland, the kind of quiet that was not peace, but the temporary absence of noise, which was a different thing entirely, though Jonas had spent a number of years pretending it was the same. He was pulling on his work gloves when the sound reached him. Not shouting this time. Footsteps. Running footsteps, uneven and irregular, the kind that belonged to someone who was not running for the pleasure of it, the sound of boots hitting dry ground with the urgency of a person who was not running towards something but away from it. He stopped with one glove on and one glove off. The footsteps came up the drive fast, then slowed, then stopped altogether. Then there was a single sharp sound, a fist against the wooden gate post, not hard enough to be aggressive, just hard enough to say, "I am here, and I need you to know it." Jonas stood in the middle of his kitchen for 2 full seconds. Then he walked to the door and opened it. She was standing at the gate with her spine absolutely straight, and that was the first thing he noticed about her, the posture, because it was the kind of posture that cost something. The kind a person holds, not because they are comfortable, but because they have decided they will not be seen any other way, regardless of what it takes. She was young, 20 or thereabouts, dark-haired, wearing a gray dress that was dark with dew along the hem and torn at the left sleeve. One side of her face was swollen beneath the cheekbone. Her lower lip was split and still bleeding in a thin line down toward her chin. Her hands at her sides were steady. She looked at him the way people look at a door they are not sure will open. "Mr. Reed," she said. Her voice was controlled and clear, and he understood immediately that she had been working to keep it that way. "My name is Nora Voss. You knew my mother." Jonas Reed did not move for a long moment. He stood in the doorway of his house in the early morning light of Ford County, Kansas, in the fall of 1884, and he looked at the daughter of Clara Voss, standing at his gate with blood on her lip and her back straight as a fence post, and he felt something shift in his chest that was not quite pain and not quite recognition, though it was closer to both of those things than anything else he knew the name of. He had not seen Clara's daughter since she was 7 years old. He had not seen Clara since the week the judgment came down. "Come in," he said. It was not eloquent. It was not what the moment perhaps deserved. But she crossed the yard and came through the door, and Jonas stepped aside to let her pass, and that much at least was something. He pulled a chair out from the kitchen table. She sat. She did not sink into it the way exhausted people sometimes do. She lowered herself carefully, like someone inventorying what hurt before committing her full weight to anything. Jonas went to the shelf for the iodine. He brought a clean cloth from the drawer. He filled the basin with water from the pump, warmer than cold, cooler than hot, and he set all of it on the table in front of her without saying anything. Then he went to the window. The light was fully gold now, the dew burning off the pasture in thin wisps of vapor, the Cimarron Creek catching the sun in small, broken flashes through the cottonwood branches. Across the second hill, invisible from this angle, the Voss place sat somewhere in the warming morning, and Jonas looked in that direction for a long time without saying anything. Behind him he heard her wring out the cloth. He heard the small sound of water in the basin. He heard her breathe, careful, and measured the breathing of a person trying to keep their composure through a task that required concentration. He had known her mother. That was true. It was also the smallest possible version of the truth, the version that left out everything that mattered, the version a man told himself at 5 in the morning when he was drinking cold coffee and looking across a pasture and listening to sounds he had decided were not his concern. He had known Clara Voss. He had been in the room the day her family's land was taken from her. And he had not said a word. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. The basin water made a small sound each time she wrung the cloth. The morning birds started up in the cottonwoods. A fly found its way through the screen and circled the room once before settling on the windowsill near Jonas's left elbow. "How bad is your face?" he said. Not quite a question. "Functional," she said. He turned from the window. She had cleaned the cut on her lip and was pressing the cloth gently below her eye where the swelling was starting to color. She was not looking at him with pleading. She was looking at him with assessment, the same way he had looked at fence lines and cattle and weather all his life, evaluating what was in front of her and deciding what it was worth. "How long have you been running?" he asked. "Since before 4 o'clock, she said. "I came along the creek bed most of the way. Softer ground." He looked at her boots. The mud along the soles confirmed it. "You came from the Voss place?" "Yes." "Harlan know you're gone yet?" Something moved across her expression that was not quite anger and not quite fear. "He will," she said. "He checks the storage room when he wakes up." Jonas processed this without showing what he thought of it. A man who locks his stepdaughter in the storage room. He had heard things over the years. He had heard things, and he had with the reliable consistency of a man who had built his entire adult life on the practice chosen not to act on what he heard. "Why here?" he asked. She reached into the front of her dress and drew out a small object, a journal no larger than her hand, the cover soft brown leather, worn almost smooth at the corners. She set it on the table between them without opening it. "My mother's," she said. "I found it in the floorboard of her room 2 years ago after she passed. I've read it enough times that I have parts of it memorized." She looked at him steadily. "She wrote your name," Nora said. "Twice. She wrote that if I was ever in real trouble, the kind that had no easy answer, I should find Jonas Reed. She said you were the only person in Caldwell she still believed had a conscience." The word fell into the kitchen like a stone into still water. Jonas looked at the journal on the table. It was small and plain and ordinary, the kind of thing a woman might buy at the general store to write down household accounts or recipes or observations about the weather. He did not reach for it. "Why would she write that?" he said, and it came out quieter than he intended. "I asked myself that for a long time," Nora said. "I couldn't understand it. Given what happened." She paused. "Given what you did." Jonas went very still. "I found the court record," she said. Her voice did not rise. She was not accusing. She was simply stating the way you state the temperature or the direction of the wind, things that are true regardless of whether you want them to be. 2 years ago, same time I found the journal. I read both of them in the same week. I understand now what your testimony meant to that hearing. I understand what the land meant to my mother. And I understand that you were there and you could have said something different, and you didn't." The fly on the windowsill moved. Outside, the cottonwood leaves made a dry, soft sound in the first morning breeze. "And you still came here," Jonas said. "My mother trusted you," Nora said. "I don't know if I trust you, but I know that you're standing in your kitchen listening to me instead of sending me back. And right now, that's all I need to know." She picked up the cloth and pressed it back to her cheek. Jonas turned back to the window. He stood there for a long time. Long enough that the morning light shifted from gold to the harder white of mid-morning. Long enough that the vapor had finished burning off the pasture and the grass had gone from silver to its ordinary September brown. He stood there, and he looked toward the Voss place, and he felt the weight of 10 years sitting on his chest, the way it always sat heavy and familiar and perfectly still, the weight of a thing a man has lived with so long he has almost mistaken it for just the way his chest feels. He went to the cabinet above the basin and took down the iodine. He set it beside the basin she was still using. He took his coat from the hook by the door. He checked the Colt at his hip, not dramatically, not with any flourish, just the practiced check of a man making sure a thing is ready before he needs it. He stopped with one hand on the doorframe. "Your mother's name was Clara," he said. He did not turn around. "She used to bring apple preserves to the church fair every October. Blackberry too some years if the summer had been wet enough. She won the blue ribbon in 1876. I remember because Harlan made a point of telling everyone at the stockyard that the preserves were made at his ranch, as if he'd had something to do with it." Nora said nothing. "I was there the day your family lost the land," Jonas said. "I stood up in front of Judge Alderman, and I told him I didn't have anything useful to say about the property lines. Those were my words. I didn't have anything useful to say." He exhaled slowly through his nose. "I had plenty to say. I knew exactly where those lines were. I had helped your grandfather run them myself 3 years before with a chain and 2 cedar posts and a half bottle of whiskey on a hot afternoon in July." The morning was very quiet around them. "I didn't say it," Jonas said, "because Harlan Voss came to my house the night before the hearing and sat at this same table and drank my coffee and looked at me and said very kindly that he hoped my family was well, and I understood what he meant, and I was afraid." He pushed the door open. "That is what I did in 1874, he said. "Now get your coat. We're going to town before he figures out you're gone." They rode out before the morning was fully awake. Jonas set the pace steady and unhurried, the kind of speed that covered ground without announcing urgency. A man riding hard drew eyes. A man riding ordinary was just a man riding. He had learned this distinction a long time ago in the way you learn things that come from necessity rather than instruction, and he applied it now with the same quiet practicality he applied to everything else. Nora rode well. She had grown up on ranch land, and it showed in the way she sat the horse easy and balanced her injured face turned slightly into the wind, as if the cool morning air was something she had decided to accept as useful. She had not said anything since they left the kitchen. Jonas had not said anything either. The road south toward Caldwell unrolled before them in a straight, pale line across the yellow-brown September grass, and the only sounds were the horses and the occasional distant complaint of a crow somewhere off to the east. After about 20 minutes, Nora said, "You said you understood what Harlan meant when he came to your house." Jonas kept his eyes on the road. "Yes." "Did he threaten you directly?" "No," Jonas said. "That was the point. A man like Harlan Voss doesn't threaten you directly. Direct threats leave witnesses. What he does is sit across your table and smile and ask after your family in a particular way, and the threat is in the particular way, and you understand it perfectly, and no one else in the world could prove that anything was said." Nora was quiet for a moment. "Did you have family to worry about?" "At the time?" "A wife," Jonas said. "Margaret. She passed 3 years after. Her heart." He paused. "I told myself I was protecting her. For a long time I told myself that. It was the story I used." "Was it true?" Partly, he said. The part that was true was that I was afraid for her. The part that wasn't true was that I couldn't have found another way. I could have gone to the circuit judge in Wichita. I could have written to the land commissioner's office in Topeka. I had options. I chose the one that kept things quiet because quiet felt safe, and I had confused safe with right. He watched a hawk riding a thermal above the cottonwoods to the south. I confused them for a very long time. The road curved around a low hill and Caldwell came into view at the base of the valley, a grid of wood-frame buildings and dirt streets, and the organized clutter of a small Kansas cattle town in the middle of its working day. The grain elevator stood tallest at the north end. The stockyard smell was faint, but present from half a mile out. "Where are we going first?" Nora asked. "Ruth Abernathy's," Jonas said. "The seamstress." "She was your mother's friend," Jonas said. "She's been in that building on Main Street for 20 years. She knows this town the way good furniture knows a house, everything that moves and where it comes from and where it goes." He glanced over at her. "She also has something that belongs to you. I expect she's been waiting for the right time to give it." Nora turned to look at him fully. "What does she have?" Jonas shook his head. "That's hers to say." They came into Caldwell from the south end past the livery and the feed store and the two-story drover's hotel with its peeling paint and its rocking chairs occupied by old men watching the street with the unhurried attention of people who have nowhere particular to be. A few heads turned as Jonas and Nora passed. Jonas nodded to the ones he knew. He kept his pace ordinary and his face unremarkable, and they made it to Ruth Abernathy's shop on Main Street without incident. The bell above the door was small and had a cracked tone from years of use. The interior smelled of fabric and cedar and the kind of order that belongs to a person who has kept the same space for a long time and knows where everything lives without having to look. Ruth Abernathy was at the cutting table when they came in. She was a solid, deliberate woman of 53 with gray-streaked hair pinned in a loose knot and hands that were always doing something, cutting or measuring or folding, as if stillness was something she had agreed to only under specific conditions. She looked up when the bell rang, assessed the situation in about 2 seconds, and set down her scissors. She came around the table and crossed to Nora, and she took the girl's face in both hands and turned it gently toward the light from the front window. She looked at the swelling and the split lip with the expression of a person who is feeling a great deal and has decided for now to feel it efficiently. She released Nora's face. "Sit down," Ruth said, "both of you." She went to the small iron stove in the back corner and put the kettle on. She moved around the shop with the quiet certainty of a woman on familiar ground, and Jonas watched her and felt something ease slightly in the tight place below his ribs, because Ruth Abernathy was one of the very few people in Ford County whose presence made him feel that things might still be navigable. She set 3 cups on the work table and looked at Jonas. "How bad is it?" she said, not asking about Nora's face. "Harlan is planning to have her sign over the remaining land interest to satisfy a debt with Clement Fitch," Jonas said. "The arrangement involves a marriage. Nora refused. Boyd put his hands on her." Ruth sat down. She folded her hands on the table. She looked at her folded hands for a moment. "Clement Fitch," she said. "Yes." She nodded slowly the way people nod when something they have been expecting for a long time has finally arrived with more exhaustion than surprise. "I've been watching Fitch work this county for 15 years, Ruth said. "He doesn't threaten, and he doesn't bully, not directly. He lends money at terms people can't meet when times are hard, and when they can't pay, he takes the land, and it all looks perfectly legal because he's made sure it is. He's got a lawyer in Wichita who handles the paperwork and a judge in Pratt County who handles the rest." Nora was listening with her hands flat on the table, very still. "Harlan is one of 6 men in this valley who owe Fitch more than they can ever pay back," Ruth continued. "He's been under Fitch's thumb for 11 years. He's not a good man, but I don't think he started out with the intention of becoming this particular kind of bad one. He just made a debt and kept making it larger, and at some point the debt owned him instead of the other way around." "It doesn't change what he did," Nora said quietly. "No," Ruth said. "It doesn't change it at all. I'm just telling you the shape of the thing you're dealing with." The kettle began to move on the stove. Ruth got up to pour. "There's something else," Jonas said. Ruth set the cups down. She looked at him. "Tell her," Jonas said. "Whatever you've been holding for Clara, it's time." Ruth stood at the work table for a long moment. Then she went to the cabinet on the north wall, the tall one with the deep shelves where she kept her bolts of cloth and her boxes of thread and notions, and she reached to the very back of the second shelf and drew out a flat tin box, the kind used for storing receipts or small documents, ordinary and unremarkable, exactly the kind of thing you would not look at twice. She set it on the table in front of Nora. "Your mother left that with me," Ruth said, 7 years ago. She came in on a Tuesday morning in October, which was unusual because Clara always came in on Thursdays when the weekly supply wagon came through and she could do everything in one trip. She was very calm. She sat exactly where you're sitting now, and she drank her tea, and we talked about ordinary things for a while, and then she put that tin box on the table and pushed it across to me. Ruth sat back down. She said, "If anything ever happens to me, give this to Nora when she's old enough to know what to do with it. Not to Harlan, not to anyone who comes asking, only to Nora." Nora looked at the tin box. She did not reach for it immediately. "What's in it?" she asked. "Open it," Ruth said. Nora lifted the lid. Inside was a folded piece of paper, and beneath it, her mother's handwriting on the inside of the lid, 3 lines in pencil. "For Nora. Everything you need is here. I trust you to know what to do with it." She unfolded the paper. It was not a letter. It was a financial document, handwritten, a bill of service, the kind a business owner issued as a record of transaction. At the top, a date, October 1874. At the bottom, a signature in a small, careful hand, C. Fitch. And in the body of the document, in plain language that left no room for interpretation, a record of payment made to G. Holt for services rendered in relation to the Alderman land hearing, Ford County. G. Holt. George Holt, who had been a deputy in 1874 and was now the sheriff of Ford County. Nora read it twice. Then she set it down flat on the table and looked at it for a long moment without speaking. "Where did she get this?" Jonas said. His voice was very quiet. "She never told me," Ruth said. "She only said that she found it by accident and that she understood what it meant and that she was going to keep it safe because she didn't know yet what to do with it, but she knew that the time would come." Jonas looked at the document. He looked at the name at the bottom and the name in the middle, and he felt the full dimensions of the thing he had stepped into this morning expanding around him in the way a storm expands, not yet arrived but entirely visible on the horizon, the kind that makes the air go still and strange before it gets to you. Fitch had bought Holt. That meant the hearing in 1874 had not been a matter of Jonas's silence tipping the scales. The scales had been weighted before Jonas ever opened his mouth. Holt had been paid to make sure the judgment went the right way, and Jonas's silence had simply been an additional convenience, an extra layer of certainty for a man who liked to have his certainties layered. The land had never been taken from Clara in a fair proceeding. It had been stolen in broad daylight, using the law as the instrument and a purchased witness as the mechanism. And Jonas had been in that room, and he had said he had nothing useful to say. He looked at Nora. She was looking at him. "You didn't know about Holt," she said. It was not a question quite, but it was close. "No," he said. "But you knew something was wrong with it, the hearing." "Yes," he said. "And you still didn't say anything." "No," he said. "I didn't." She held his gaze for a long moment. There was something in her expression that was not anger exactly and not forgiveness either, but something that existed between those two things in the particular territory that belongs to a person who has decided to keep moving forward regardless of the full weight of what they understand. "Then this," she said, and she touched the document on the table, "is how we finish it." Outside on Main Street, a horse came up at a quick trot and stopped. Then two. The sound of boots on the boardwalk. Ruth was at the window before Jonas had fully stood. She turned back to them. Her face was controlled. "Harlan," she said. "Boyd is with him." She paused. "Sheriff Holt is with them." Jonas was already on his feet. He felt the weight below his ribs, and for the first time in 10 years, he did not try to set it aside or name it something manageable. He let it sit exactly where it was, and he stood up straight under it. He looked at Nora. She had already folded the document and put it back inside her dress, her movements quick and certain, a person who had thought about what she would do when this moment arrived. She straightened in her chair and looked at the door with the expression of a person who has been waiting for exactly this and has decided some time ago exactly how they intend to meet it. "Whatever happens in the next few minutes," Jonas said, "you don't hand that paper to anyone except a judge. You understand me?" "I understand you," she said. The bell above the shop door rang. Harlan Voss came in first, which was the expected thing because Harlan always came first in a room when he could manage it, always arranged himself as the reasonable man at the center of a misunderstanding. He was a large man, broad through the shoulders, with a face that had learned over many years to perform concern in situations that required something else entirely. He was wearing his good hat, and his expression was the careful, measured expression of a grieving father. Boyd came in behind him. He was younger and less practiced at the performance. He scanned the room quickly, found Nora, and something moved through his face that might have been relief but was gone too fast to name. Sheriff George Holt came in last. He was a careful, deliberate man of 52, who moved through the world with the practiced ease of someone who had held authority long enough that it had become indistinguishable from his actual personality. He looked at Jonas with an expression of professional calm. "Jonas," Holt said. "George," Jonas said. Harlan Voss had already turned toward Nora with his hands slightly open, the universal gesture of harmless intention. "Nora," he said. "You had us worried, sweetheart." Nora said nothing. She looked at her stepfather the way you look at a thing you have looked at for a long time and have finally decided you are done looking at. "She came to me," Jonas said. "On her own. Walking." Harlan turned to Jonas with an expression of patient reasonableness. "Jonas, I appreciate your concern, I do, but this is a family matter and Nora has a tendency to get herself turned around when she's upset. She says things that aren't quite right." "She said you locked her in the storage room," Jonas said. "She was having one of her spells," Harlan said. "She does that sometimes. It's nothing to worry about." The word hung in the room, spell, and Jonas watched Ruth Abernathy's expression from the corner of his eye and saw the particular stillness that comes over a woman who is hearing a familiar kind of lie being told about a person she loves. Holt stepped forward slightly. He looked at Jonas with his professional calm still fully in place, but beneath it Jonas could see something else operating, a calculation, a careful assessment of the room and the witnesses and the possible directions this could go. "Harlan filed a formal concern this morning," Holt said. "Says Nora left the property in a disturbed state and may have taken some documents that belong to the household." "What documents?" Jonas said. Holt looked at him. The calculation behind his professional calm ran a little faster. "Harlan says there were some papers she got hold of that she doesn't quite understand," Holt said. "Things that might look like one thing but are actually another." Jonas looked at the sheriff for a long moment. He looked at the man he had known for 15 years, the man who had come to church and attended stockyard meetings and sat on the town improvement committee and had in 1874 accepted money from Clement Fitch to make sure a widow lost her land. "I'm sure you'd know something about papers that look like one thing but are actually another, George," Jonas said. His voice was absolutely level. The professional calm did not break, but something shifted behind it. Boyd made a short, impatient sound. "Enough of this," he said. "Nora, come on, we're going home." He took a step toward her. Jonas moved between them. He did not raise his hands. He did not touch Boyd. He simply put himself in the space between Boyd Voss and Nora Voss and stood there entirely still and looked at the younger man with an expression that contained no anger and no dramatics and nothing at all except a very plain refusal. "Don't," Jonas said. Just that word. Quiet and final and with the particular weight of a man who has been carrying something for 10 years and has just set it down and is standing up straight for the first time. Boyd stopped. The bell above the shop door did not ring. No one moved. The morning light came through Ruth Abernathy's front window and lay across the floor in a flat, pale rectangle, and in that rectangle the dust motes moved in their slow, indifferent circles, and Jonas Reed stood between a young woman and the people who meant to use her. And this time, for the first time in 10 years, he did not step aside. Outside, the ordinary sounds of Caldwell, Kansas continued without any awareness that anything had changed. Boots on boardwalks, a wagon, 2 men discussing the price of winter wheat at the far end of the block. The crow that had been complaining to the east was complaining now somewhere closer, invisible and persistent, as if it had something it had been waiting all morning to say. Inside Ruth Abernathy's shop, nobody spoke. But the silence this time was not the silence of a man looking across a pasture and choosing to go back inside. This was a different kind of silence entirely. This was the silence of a man who had finally, 10 years too late, and not one moment after, decided what kind of man he was going to be. The silence in Ruth Abernathy's shop lasted long enough to become its own kind of statement. Harlan Voss was the first to break it, which was the expected thing, because men like Harlan had an instinctive understanding that silence in a room full of witnesses was a territory that did not favor them. He cleared his throat and adjusted his hat and reassembled his expression of patient reasonableness with the practiced efficiency of a man who had worn that particular face for so many years it had become almost automatic. "Jonas," he said, and his voice carried the careful warmth of a man addressing a neighbor across a fence line, reasonable and unhurried, the voice of someone who has not yet chosen to be offended. "I understand you're trying to do right by the girl. I respect that. I genuinely do. But you're operating on one side of a story here, and there's another side that looks considerably different." "I'd be interested to hear it," Jonas said. He had not moved from the space between Boyd and Nora. Harlan spread his hands slightly, the gesture of a man with nothing to hide. "Nora has had a difficult time since her mother passed. That's the truth of it. Clara's death hit her hard, and she's never quite settled since. She gets ideas. She misreads situations. She takes things out of context and builds a picture from them that doesn't match the actual facts." He paused. "I've tried to be patient with her. I've tried to give her stability. Clement Fitch is a respected businessman in this county, and the arrangement I've discussed with him is nothing more than what any father would consider for a daughter who needs looking after." "She's 20 years old," Ruth said from behind the cutting table. "And she's still under my roof and my care," Harlan said, turning toward Ruth with the same patient warmth, slightly thinned now. "Which is a legal fact, Ruth, whatever your personal feelings about it." "She came to me on foot before sunrise," Jonas said, "with a split lip and a swollen face. You want to tell me the other side of that particular picture?" Harlan's expression shifted slightly. A small recalibration, the look of a man deciding which version of the truth to reach for. "Boyd and Nora had a disagreement," he said finally. "It got out of hand. Boyd regrets it." He glanced at Boyd as he said this, a sideways look that contained a clear instruction, and Boyd, who had been standing with his jaw tight and his eyes moving between Jonas and the floor, said without any particular conviction, "I regret it." The words sat in the room like something dropped from a considerable height. Nora had not spoken since the door opened. She sat at the work table with her hands flat on the surface, and she listened to her stepfather describe her life with the expression of someone who has heard a version of this story many times before and has stopped being surprised by it, though the not being surprised had never quite shaded into the not feeling it. Sheriff Holt had taken up a position near the door, not blocking it exactly, but occupying it in a way that made its use feel like a matter requiring consideration. He had his thumbs in his belt and his weight on his left heel, and he was watching the room with the careful attention of a man who is simultaneously managing several problems and trying to make sure none of them become the same problem. "Here's where things stand," Holt said in the measured tone of institutional authority, the voice that was supposed to end conversations by virtue of the badge above it. "Harlan has filed a formal concern with my office. I'm obligated to look into it. If Nora wants to make a statement about what happened at the Voss property, she can do that at my office. If there are documents that belong to the Voss household, Those need to be returned." He looked at Jonas. "And if you've got something to say about any of this, Jonas, you can say it through the proper process." "The proper process," Jonas said. "That's right." Jonas looked at the sheriff for a long moment. He looked at the man he had watched run elections and settle disputes and sit at the head of the 4th of July committee for the better part of a decade, the man whose name was on a handwritten receipt in a tin box that was now sitting open on Ruth Abernathy's work table. "Tell me something, George," Jonas said. His voice was conversational and easy and not unkind, which somehow made it worse. "In October of 1874, when you testified at the Alderman land hearing, were you feeling particularly civic-minded that day, or was there something specific that motivated your contribution to the proceedings?" The room went very still. Holt's face did not shatter. It was built too well for that. But something moved behind it in the space of 2 seconds, small and controlled and unmistakable to anyone paying close attention. His weight shifted off his left heel. His thumbs came out of his belt. His eyes moved to Harlan Voss and back to Jonas in a single quick movement that he controlled immediately but not quickly enough. "I don't know what you're referring to," Holt said. "I think you do," Jonas said. "I think the moment I said 1874 you knew exactly what I was referring to. And I think the fact that you went straight to Harlan when you should have been looking at me tells a considerable story about whose interests you're managing here." Boyd made a short, hard sound. "This is nonsense," he said. "Dad, let's just take her and go." "Nobody is taking anyone," Ruth said. Her voice cut across the room with a clarity that stopped Boyd mid-step, the voice of a woman who had been folding fabric and holding her tongue for several minutes and had decided she was finished with both activities. She came around the cutting table and stood beside Jonas, and she was not a large woman, but the way she occupied the space she was standing in made the room feel considerably smaller. "Nora is here of her own choosing. She is 20 years old. She is not property, and she is not a document, and she does not go anywhere in this room or out of it without her own agreement. Is that understood?" It was not quite a question. Harlan looked at her. The patient warmth had thinned to almost nothing now, the way light thins late in the afternoon, still present, but no longer doing any real work. "Ruth," he said, "you've always had a soft spot for lost causes. I've always admired that about you. But this is not your fight." "Clara Voss was my friend for 22 years, Ruth said. "Her daughter is sitting at my table. You want to tell me again whose fight this is?" The kettle on the iron stove had been sending up a thin, steady whistle for the past several minutes unnoticed until now, and in the silence after Ruth's words, it was suddenly the loudest thing in the room, that small, persistent sound. The sound of something that had reached its limit and was saying so in the only way available to it. Ruth went to the stove and took the kettle off without hurrying. Holt looked at Jonas. The calculation behind his eyes was running hard now, assessing the room, the witnesses, the document he didn't know was in the tin box, but suspected existed in some form, because men like Holt developed a specific kind of alertness around old business that might have left records. He was doing what careful men do when the ground shifts under them, identifying the exits, calculating the distances, deciding which path left the most options open. "This conversation has gone far enough for a shop on Main Street," Holt said finally. "Harlan, why don't you and Boyd head over to my office and I'll sort this out properly." He looked at Jonas. "You too, Jonas. And Nora if she wants to make a statement." "She'll make a statement," Jonas said, "in front of witnesses, not in a room with a closed door." Holt's jaw tightened slightly. "My office is a legal facility." "Your office is a room with a closed door," Jonas said. "We'll make whatever statements need making right here where Ruth and everyone else who happens to come through that door can hear them, unless you've got a specific objection to transparency." The word transparency landed in the room with the particular weight of a word that means more than its syllables in a specific context. Holt heard it. Harlan heard it. Even Boyd, who was not a man of particular subtlety, went still in a way that suggested he understood something had shifted. Harlan Voss made his decision in the space of a breath, the decision of a man who has been maneuvering in tight spaces for so long that he makes these calculations before he has fully finished thinking them through. "Fine," he said. He smiled, and the smile was almost convincing. "We can talk here. I have nothing to hide. I want Nora home safe, and this misunderstanding resolved, and if we can accomplish that standing in Ruth's shop, then that suits me perfectly well." He sat down uninvited in the chair across from Nora. He looked at her with the expression he used when he wanted to appear as a man who was genuinely grieved by a situation he had not caused, and Jonas watched Nora look back at him, and he saw something in her face that he had not expected. Not fear, not even the anger he would have understood. Something quieter and more durable than either of those things. The expression of a person who has decided completely and without reservation that they are done. "Nora," Harlan said gently, "come home. Whatever you think you found, whatever story you've built around it, we can talk about it. As a family." Nora looked at her stepfather for a long moment. Then she reached into her dress and placed the folded document on the table. She did not unfold it. She placed it flat, and she put her hand over it, and she looked at Harlan Voss with those steady brown eyes, and she said in a voice so quiet that everyone in the room leaned slightly forward to hear it, "Tell me what this is." Harlan looked at her hand on the paper. Something moved across his face that was not the patient warmth and was not the performance of the grieved father. It was faster and less practiced than either of those things, a flash of something that looked for just a moment like recognition. "I don't know what that is," he said. "I can't see it." "No," Nora said. "But you already know, don't you?" The morning outside was fully established now, the street sounds of Caldwell in its working hours coming through the front window in the steady, ordinary rhythm of a town going about its day. Boots, wagon wheels, a man calling to another man about something unremarkable. The crow had stopped. In the far distance, very faintly, the stockyard smell drifted on the south wind, and in Ruth Abernathy's shop, Harlan Voss sat across from his stepdaughter, and for the first time in the 10 minutes he had been in the room, he did not say anything at all. It was Boyd who moved first. He pushed off the wall where he had been leaning and took 2 steps toward the table and reached for the document with the blunt directness of a man who has run out of patience with subtlety and has decided that the direct approach, whatever its consequences, is preferable to standing still. His hand came down fast toward the paper on the table. Jonas caught his wrist. Not dramatically, not with the kind of violence that announces itself. He simply caught it the way you catch a thing that is falling quickly and with enough grip to stop its movement, and he held it and looked at Boyd Voss with the same plain expression he had used when he stepped between him and Nora, an expression that contained no anger and no threat, just a very quiet and absolute refusal. Boyd pulled. Jonas held. Boyd pulled harder. "Let go of me," Boyd said. "When you take your hand off that table," Jonas said. They stood like that for 3 seconds, which is a considerable length of time when 2 men are locked in a physical contest in a small room. Boyd was younger and broader through the shoulders, but Jonas had 30 years of working land in his hands and arms, and he had not spent a moment of those years doing anything gentle to his body. And when Boyd pulled a 3rd time and still did not move, Jonas's grip, something went out of the younger man's face, a species of certainty that had been there from the beginning and was now quietly gone. Boyd released the table. Jonas released his wrist. Boyd stepped back. He rubbed his wrist with his other hand, and he looked at Jonas with an expression that had lost its aggression and gained something that was harder to name, something that in a different man and a different moment might have been called the beginning of doubt. "That's assault," Harlan said sharply. He turned to Holt. "George, you saw that. That's assault on my son." Holt was looking at the document on the table, still folded, still under Nora's hand. He was looking at it the way a man looks at something he has been half expecting and half dreading for a long time. The authority had not left his face entirely, but it had thinned to something Jonas could see through clearly. Jonas was not standing at a distance. "George," Harlan said again, his voice sharper. Holt looked up. He looked at Harlan, and he looked at Jonas, and he looked at Nora, and he looked at Ruth, standing by the stove with the kettle in her hand, and the expression of a woman who has held 20 years of knowledge quietly and is in the specific process of deciding she is finished doing that. And Jonas watched him and understood in the way that a man who has spent a long life observing other people sometimes understands things before they are spoken. That George Holt was standing at the same crossroads that Jonas Reed had stood at in 1874. The crossroads where the road to the right was harder and the road to the left was easier, and the easy road had a way of appearing safe until you had walked it far enough that you could no longer see where you started. Jonas had taken the easy road. He had been walking it for 10 years. He knew every stone of it. What happened next happened slowly, which was unusual for the kind of scene it was, and Jonas would think about that slowness later in the days after and understand that it felt slow because everyone in the room was making a decision, and decisions of that particular weight and permanence move at their own pace regardless of the urgency of the circumstances around them. Holt said, "Harlan, step outside with me for a minute." Harlan stood. He buttoned the middle button of his coat, a small automatic gesture, the gesture of a man restoring order to his presentation. He looked at Nora, and the look had lost its warmth entirely. Now it was a flat and assessing look, the look of a man recalculating a transaction that was not going the way the numbers had suggested it would. "We're not finished," he told her. "No," she said. "We're not." He went outside. Holt followed. Through the front window Jonas could see them on the boardwalk, Harlan speaking quickly and quietly, Holt listening with his arms crossed and his head slightly bowed, the posture of a man receiving information he is not enjoying. Boyd remained inside. He had moved to the far side of the shop and was standing near the shelves of fabric bolts with his arms at his sides and his eyes on the floor. He was not looking at Nora. He was not looking at Jonas. He was looking at the floor with the particular blankness of a person who is conducting a conversation with themselves that they would prefer to be having in private. Ruth set the kettle on the work table and poured 2 cups and pushed one toward Nora and one toward the empty air in Jonas's direction, and then poured one for herself and sat down. The ordinariness of the action, the pure domestic plainness of 3 people at a table with cups of tea, had a strange stabilizing effect on the room, as if Ruth had introduced a counterweight. Jonas remained standing. He looked at Boyd. "You going to be a problem?" Jonas said. Not aggressively, simply. Boyd looked up from the floor. He looked at Jonas, and then at Nora, and his expression moved through several things quickly, none of which he seemed to choose intentionally, and then settled into something that was less readable than anything that had come before it. "I don't know," Boyd said. It was the most honest thing he had said since entering the room. Nora looked at her stepbrother. She looked at him the way you look at a thing that has hurt you, that you have also known for a long time with a complicated familiarity that does not resolve easily into either forgiveness or hatred. "You hit me," she said. "I know it," Boyd said. "You've hit me before." "I know that too." The room was very quiet. "Why?" she said. Boyd looked at the floor again. His jaw moved. When he spoke his voice was lower than it had been. "Because that's how things got done in that house," he said. "Because Dad handled things that way, and his father handled things that way, and I never thought about whether there was another way to handle them. Because when you pushed back it felt like disorder, and disorder in that house had consequences, and it was easier to stop the disorder than to deal with the consequences." He stopped. He looked up. "That's not an excuse." "No," Nora said. "It's not." "I know it's not," Boyd said. Something in the air of the room had changed in a way that was subtle and not quite nameable. Jonas felt it. Ruth felt it. He could see it in the way she was watching Boyd, not with the warmth she had for Nora, but with a careful and unresolved attention. The boardwalk outside went quiet. The door opened. Holt came back in alone. He closed the door behind him, and he stood in the shop with his hand still on the door handle, and he looked at the room at Jonas and Nora and Ruth and Boyd, and he had put himself back together. But the effort showed now in the way effort shows on a face that has been maintaining a particular expression for too long, the structure intact, the cost visible. "Harlan has gone to get Clement Fitch," Holt said. The name fell into the room and everyone in it received it differently. Ruth went still. Nora's hand pressed flatter on the document. Jonas felt something in his chest tighten and release in the same motion, the feeling of a situation clarifying. "Why?" Jonas said. "Because Fitch is the one with the legal standing in this situation," Holt said. "The debt is his. The arrangement is his. If there's going to be any resolution here, he's the one who has to be part of it." Jonas looked at the sheriff carefully. "Whose idea was it to bring him? Harlan's or yours?" Holt met his eyes. "Harlan's," he said, and Jonas could not tell with complete certainty whether that was true. "How long?" Ruth asked. 20 minutes, Holt said. "He keeps an office above the land exchange on 2nd Street. Ruth looked at Jonas. Jonas looked at Nora. Nora looked at the document under her hand and then up at the window, and then at Jonas with an expression of complete attention. "What do we do?" she said. "We stay here," Jonas said. "We don't go anywhere, we don't split up, and we do not hand that paper to anyone who comes through that door except in front of every person in this room." Holt said, "Jonas, whatever you think is in that document." "I know what's in it, George," Jonas said. The silence that followed was of a different quality from the silences that had come before it. It had an edge to it. It had the particular texture of a silence that exists between two people who are now both fully aware of what the other knows, with nothing left to pretend about. Holt sat down in the chair Harlan had vacated. He sat in it heavily the way tired men sit, and he rested his forearms on his thighs, and he looked at the floor for a moment. He was 52 years old, and he had a face that showed his years honestly, lines cut deep from sun and wind, and the particular strain of maintaining a public self over a long period of time. "You don't know everything about 1874, he said. His voice was quieter now. The institutional authority had drained out of it, leaving something underneath that was less polished and more human. "Tell me what I don't know," Jonas said. Holt was quiet for a long time. The street outside moved in its ordinary rhythms. Somewhere a door opened and closed. A horse went by at a walk. "My wife was sick that year," Holt said. "The fall of 1874. She'd been sick since July, and the doctor in Wichita was talking about a procedure that cost more money than I made in a year and a half of deputy's pay." He looked at his hands. "Fitch came to me in September. He was very calm about it. He said he had a business matter that required a witness who understood how to answer certain questions in a certain way, and he was prepared to be generous in exchange for that service." He paused. "He knew about my wife. He knew about the Wichita doctor. He knew about the money. I don't know to this day how he knew. He just knew." The room was completely still. "She lived," Holt said. "Margaret. She lived another 8 years after that procedure. She died in 1882 of something unrelated, just her heart giving out one morning in the kitchen." He straightened slightly. "I told myself after that what I'd done to save her life. And that was true. And it was also true that I had done a thing that couldn't be undone, and that I had been living with that since October of 1874 and intended to go on living with it until I was in the ground." Nobody spoke. "Clara Voss lost her land," he said. He looked at Nora. "Your mother lost everything she had because I needed money for my wife, and I told myself that was a reasonable exchange. I have thought about that more times than I could count." He stopped. Then, "I don't say this to ask for anything. I just want you to know that I knew what I was doing, and I knew what it cost, and I did it anyway, and I am telling you that plainly because you deserve to hear it plainly." Nora looked at the sheriff of Ford County for a long time. "My mother knew," she said. "She had that receipt. She knew what it meant, and she never told anyone." "She came to see me once," Holt said. "About a year before she died. She sat across from my desk and she told me she knew. She said she hadn't decided yet what to do about it. She said she was still thinking about what her mother would have done." He looked at his hands again. "She never came back. A few months later she was gone. Ruth said very quietly, "That was Clara. She was always thinking about what her mother would have done." The front door opened. Clement Fitch came in. He came in the way Jonas had known, without having been told that he would come in slowly and with complete composure, the way a man enters a room when he has decided that the room belongs to him, regardless of whose name is on the deed. He was older than Jonas by about a decade, lean and well-kept, in the particular way of men who have spent their lives in offices and account books rather than on horseback. His coat was good quality. His boots showed town, not trail. His white hair was combed with precision. He was not a large man physically, but he had the quality of taking up more space than his actual dimensions would suggest, the quality of a man accustomed to having the room organize itself around him. He closed the door behind him. He took in the room in a single, unhurried sweep. Jonas, Nora, Ruth Boyd Holt, the table, the tin box, the document under Nora's hand. "Jonas Reed," he said, and his voice was warm with recognition, almost friendly. "It's been a while." "Clement," Jonas said. Fitch moved to the chair at the end of the table and sat without being invited, and folded his hands on the surface in front of him with the ease of a man who has sat at many tables and found them all comfortable. He looked at Nora with an expression of polite interest that contained nothing warm and nothing threatening, purely evaluative, the expression of a man looking at a column of figures. "I understand there's been some confusion," he said. "I don't think anyone in this room is confused," Jonas said. Fitch looked at him. A small adjustment moved through his expression, almost imperceptible, the adjustment of a man recalibrating the nature of the conversation he has walked into. "You're here to help the girl," Fitch said. "That's admirable. Genuinely. You've always had a strong sense of obligation, Jonas. I remember that about you." The pause before what came next was precisely calibrated. "Even back in '74, when things were complicated, you were a man who felt his obligations." Jonas said nothing. "Harlan's situation is straightforward." Fitch continued, his voice remaining perfectly level and conversational. "He has a debt. The debt is legal. The arrangement for resolution is legal. The girl is of an age where such arrangements are common and well within the scope of what a guardian can facilitate." He glanced at Nora. "I understand you have objections. That's understandable, but objections don't change the legal architecture of the situation." "The legal architecture," Ruth said. She said it the way you repeat something back to someone to let them hear how it sounds out loud. Fitch looked at her without offense. "Yes, the law is the law, Ruth, whatever we feel about it personally." "The law," Jonas said, "is also something Clement Fitch has spent 15 years purchasing, the way he purchases other things he finds useful." The temperature in the room dropped by several degrees. Fitch looked at Jonas. The warmth and the friendliness and the polite ease did not leave his face entirely, but they became thinner, the way a cloud becomes thinner when it passes in front of the sun. Still present, still performing its function, but with less substance than before. "That's a serious accusation," Fitch said. "It's a statement of what I know," Jonas said. "What you think you know," Fitch said. He had not raised his voice. He had not changed his posture. He was a man who had spent 65 years learning that composure was more effective than noise, and he wore it like armor. "You think you know a great many things, Jonas. You always did. But knowing things and being able to prove them, and being able to prove them in a way that a court will hear them, are three very different matters." He looked at the document under Nora's hand. "For instance," he said almost gently, "a young woman takes a piece of paper from her stepfather's house and brings it to a shop and holds it under her hand and tells people it proves something. That's a story. The law likes documents with provenance. The law likes witnesses whose credibility is established. The law likes things that have been handled in a particular way by particular people with standing to handle them." He looked at Jonas. "You testified in a land hearing 10 years ago," Fitch said. "You said you had nothing useful to contribute. That's in the record. Now you want to tell a different story." The warmth was entirely gone from his voice, now replaced by something cooler and more precise. "What you are is a man who lied under oath a decade ago and is now trying to turn that into something useful for himself. What a court will see is a man with a 10-year-old grievance and a convenient new story. Jonas knew what Fitch was doing. He had watched men do it all his life, locate the thing a person is protecting and apply pressure there. He had spent 10 years being the kind of man that tactic worked on. And then he felt something he had not expected. He felt it lift, not disappear, not resolve. Simply lift, the way a thing lifts when you pick it up yourself, instead of letting it sit on you, the transfer of a weight from a place it has settled to a place where it can be carried, which is different from the place where it has merely pressed you down. He looked at Clement Fitch, 65 years old, lean and composed, and accustomed to winning, and he said in a voice that was completely level, "You're right about everything you just said." Fitch blinked. It was the first involuntary movement he had made. "I lied under oath in 1874, Jonas said. "I said I had nothing useful to say, and I had plenty to say, and I chose not to say it because I was afraid of what you'd do to my family. That's the truth of what I did. It's in the record the way you said it is, and a court will see it the way you described, and there is nothing I can do to change any of that." He paused. The room was absolutely still. "I'm going to stand up in front of whatever judge will hear me, and I'm going to say exactly that," Jonas said. "All of it, including your name, including the visit you paid to my house the night before the hearing, including the specific words you used when you asked after my family." He looked at Fitch without blinking. "A man with nothing left to hide is a man you can't threaten, Clement. You built your whole operation on the leverage of other people's secrets. I'm telling you mine out loud in front of witnesses. Right now." Fitch said nothing. "And when I'm done telling mine," Jonas said, "Nora is going to unfold that paper." The room was so quiet that the sound of Nora unfolding the document was audible to everyone in it. The crisp, small sound of paper opening, the sound of something that has been waiting to be read. She placed it flat on the table. She looked at Sheriff George Holt. Holt looked at the receipt with his name on it and Fitch's signature below it, the record of a transaction in October 1874, and he sat with it for a long moment, and Jonas watched him sit with it, and understood that George Holt was also standing at a crossroads, the same one he had stood at before, but this time the choice was not between easy and hard, it was between two versions of hard, one of which you survived and one of which you did not. Holt picked up the receipt. He looked at it for a long time. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in his coat pocket. And he looked at Clement Fitch, and he said in a voice from which all the professional calm had been stripped down to its bare wood, "Clement Fitch, I'm placing you under arrest on suspicion of corruption of a public official and fraudulent inducement in the conduct of a legal proceeding." Fitch looked at him with an expression that moved through several things very quickly. Disbelief, calculation, a flash of something that might have been fear, and then back to composure, a lesser composure than before, but composure nonetheless. "George," Fitch said carefully, "think about what you're doing." "I have been," Holt said, "for 10 years. He stood up. "I've been thinking about it every day since October of 1874. He came around the table. Fitch looked at Jonas. He looked at Nora. He looked at Ruth standing by the stove with her arms folded. He looked at Boyd near the fabric shelves, who was looking at the floor again, but with a different quality of attention, now the attention of a young man watching something shift that he had believed was immovable. And Clement Fitch, who had spent 40 years building a structure of leverage and purchase and carefully maintained composure, and who had walked into Ruth Abernathy's shop on a September morning, believing he was walking into a problem he had already solved, understood that the room had changed around him in a way he had not anticipated and could not reverse. He stood up when Holt reached him. He did not resist. He straightened his coat, the same small automatic gesture Harlan had used, the gesture of men who keep their presentation in order because the presentation is the last thing they believe they control. "You'll regret this, George," he said quietly. "I already regret it," Holt said. "That's rather the point." He walked Fitch to the door. Outside on the boardwalk through the window, Jonas could see Harlan Voss standing where he had left him, and could see the exact moment Harlan understood what he was watching, The moment the shape of everything he had built his last 11 years on rearranged itself in front of him into something he could no longer use. Jonas looked at Nora. She was watching the window with her hands flat on the table where the document had been, the table now empty of it, the tin box open beside her, her mother's 3 penciled lines visible inside the lid. For Nora. Everything you need is here. I trust you to know what to do with it. Her face was very still. Then she looked at Jonas, and what was in her face was not triumph, and it was not relief, and it was not the simple satisfaction of a thing concluded. It was something quieter and more complex, and considerably more durable than any of those things. It was the expression of a person who has reached the end of a long and difficult piece of work and is permitting themselves for exactly this moment to acknowledge that they are still standing. "What happens now?" she said. Jonas looked at the window at the street outside at Harlan Voss, standing on the Caldwell boardwalk in the morning light, watching his certainties rearrange themselves around him. "Now," Jonas said, "we make sure it holds." He pulled a chair out from the table. For the first time that morning he sat down. The afternoon came on slowly the way September afternoons did in southern Kansas, the light thickening from white to gold, without any single moment you could point to, as the shadows of the buildings on Main Street, lengthening in small increments across the hard-packed dirt until they reached the far boardwalk and climbed it and kept going. The stockyard smell on the south wind had deepened with the heat of the day. Somewhere on the far side of town a hammer was working against something that needed to be built or repaired, the sound carrying flat and clean through the still air. Inside Ruth Abernathy's shop, the ordinary sounds of a working afternoon had resumed around them. The small sounds of fabric and scissors, and the iron stove cooling, and the occasional bell above the door as customers came and went, because life in Caldwell did not stop for the private crises of its inhabitants, and Ruth had decided with the quiet practicality that characterized everything she did, that conducting business while the dust settled was preferable to sitting with locked doors and mounting tension. 2 customers had come in during the 2 hours since Holt had walked Fitch out the front door. The first was the wife of the grain elevator manager, a sharp-eyed woman named Dorothy Pruitt, who had taken in the scene with one comprehensive sweep of her attention and then proceeded to discuss her order for 3 yards of winter wool with a focus that Jonas recognized as the Ford County version of deliberate discretion. She had seen plenty and would remember all of it and say nothing until the moment it became useful to say something. The second was a boy of about 12 delivering a parcel of buttons from the dry goods store across the street, who had looked at the tin box and the open journal on the table and the 4 adults sitting around it in the middle of the afternoon, and apparently decided this was the most interesting thing he had seen all week. A conclusion he kept to himself until he was back outside and out of earshot, at which point Jonas could hear him running. Nora had not left the shop. Jonas had not left either. He had considered it twice, both times decided against it, and was now settled into the understanding that the afternoon was going to be spent in Ruth Abernathy's chairs, waiting for the next version of the problem to arrive, because problems of this particular kind did not resolve themselves in a single morning. They resolved themselves in stages, and the stages had their own timing, and there was nothing useful a man could do about that except remain present and pay attention. Boyd Voss had left about 40 minutes after Holt walked out with Fitch. He had stood by the fabric shelves for a long time, saying nothing, and then he had looked at Nora with an expression Jonas had seen only once before in his life on the face of a man in Wichita who had just understood midway through a card game the full extent of what he had lost, and then he had walked out without speaking. Nora had watched him go and had not called after him, and had not turned back to the table for a full minute, just stood looking at the door after it closed. Ruth had poured more tea. Harlan had disappeared from the boardwalk sometime during the first hour. Jonas had watched through the front window and noted the moment the spot where Harlan had been standing became simply empty boardwalk, and had filed that away with the careful attention of a man who has learned that the movements of a cornered person are not always predictable and are almost always worth tracking. The town around them was not as uninformed as it had been that morning. Caldwell was not a large town, And Clement Fitch was not an obscure man within it, and the sight of Sheriff Holt walking Fitch from Ruth Abernathy's shop to the county office in the middle of a Tuesday morning had done what visible things in small towns invariably did. It had spoken before anyone said a word, and by noon the speaking had spread outward from Main Street in the reliable fashion of water finding its level, along the boardwalks and through the saloon and the grain exchange and the barber shop and the dry goods store and the informal infrastructure of a cattle town through which information moved with a speed that would have surprised anyone who assumed that nothing much happened in southern Kansas. What Caldwell was hearing, Jonas understood, was still incomplete. It was the shape of something without the full details. A man of standing arrested the Reed rancher involved the Voss girl at the center of it. The details would come. They would come through the legal process, and through the conversations that surrounded the legal process, and through the version of events that various people would tell in various rooms over the coming days. What mattered now was that the version with the most accuracy and the most documentation got there first. Ruth understood this too. She had said as much about an hour in her characteristically direct way. "The circuit judge sits in Pratt County," she said. "His name is Alderman. Same judge from the 1874 hearing." Jonas looked at her. "The same man." "The same man," Ruth confirmed. "He's been on that bench for 17 years. He's not Fitch's judge in the sense that Fitch owns him, but he knows Fitch well enough to be careful about what conclusions he draws without adequate documentation." She paused. "Fitch has walked out of worse situations than this because the documentation wasn't sufficient." "The receipt has his signature," Nora said. "The receipt is one document," Ruth said. "In a proceeding where Fitch's lawyer from Wichita will argue provenance, chain of custody, context, and anything else he can find to complicate the picture." She looked at Jonas. "We need more than one piece of paper." Jonas had been thinking about this since Holt left. "Harlan's debts," he said. "The actual loan documents. If Fitch has been operating the way you described, there will be a pattern in those documents. Terms that look legal but are structured to ensure default. He won't have done it to just Harlan. He'll have done it to everyone he's worked with the same way." "And those documents are in Fitch's office," Ruth said. "Some of them," Jonas said. "The rest will be with his lawyer in Wichita." "The ones here are accessible," Ruth said carefully. "Not without Holt," Jonas said. They looked at each other. "Do you think he'll move on it?" Nora said. Jonas considered the question honestly. George Holt had been a man in a particular kind of trouble for 10 years, the kind that accumulates interest the way bad debts do, growing larger and heavier with each year of maintenance, each new decision made in service of the original wrong decision. He had sat in that chair and spoken with the quality of a man who had made a private accounting of his own situation and arrived at a number he could not argue with. Whether that accounting would translate into action under the pressure of the next hours when Fitch's lawyer arrived from Wichita and the legal counteroffensive began in earnest was a different question. "I think," Jonas said slowly, "that George Holt has been waiting for someone to make the first move for a long time. He needed to see someone else willing to pay the cost before he could commit to paying his own." He looked at the table. "That may be enough. I don't know." The bell above the door rang. It was not Holt. It was not Harlan. It was a man Jonas had not expected, and the appearance of him in Ruth Abernathy's doorway shifted the temperature of the afternoon in a way that was not immediately comfortable. The man's name was Warren Price. He was 60 years old, rangy with sun-darkened skin and a gray mustache, and the particular quiet that belonged to men who had spent most of their lives making independent decisions on land far from other people. He ran the second-largest cattle operation in Ford County, the one that sat between Jonas's property and the Cimarron Creek bottoms. He and Jonas had a relationship of mutual respect and minimal conversation, the relationship of two neighboring ranchers who shared a fence line and a water source, and 20 years of understanding that neither of them would benefit from being enemies. Price came in and looked at the room and removed his hat. "Ruth," he said. "Warren," Ruth said. He looked at Jonas. "Heard you had an eventful morning." "Some," Jonas said. Price turned his hat in his hands once. I heard Holt took Fitch in. Yes. Price was quiet for a moment. He looked at Nora without the evaluative quality that Fitch had used, with something more like recognition, the look of a man placing a face he has seen before in a different context. "You're Clara Voss's daughter," he said. "Yes, sir," Nora said. Price nodded slowly. He looked back at Jonas. "Fitch has got paper on my operation," he said. "Not the main section, the East pasture land I bought in 1879. The terms were standard when I signed them, and then they weren't standard anymore. And by the time I understood what had changed, I was already in it." He paused. "I am not the only man in this county in that position." Jonas looked at him carefully. "How many?" "That I know of for certain, 4 besides myself. That I suspect more." Price put his hat back on. "If someone is building a case against Clement Fitch, I would like to be part of that building." He looked at Jonas steadily. "And I suspect the others would too, if someone asked them directly instead of waiting for them to volunteer." The afternoon had just acquired a different shape. Ruth stood up and went to the back room and returned with paper and a pen and an ink bottle and set them on the table without ceremony, the action of a woman who understands when record-keeping has become an urgent priority. "Sit down, Warren," she said. "Tell us everything you know about the terms." He sat, and Jonas looked at the paper and the ink and the afternoon light coming through the front window and understood that the architecture of what had seemed like an immovable situation had just developed another crack, the kind that spreads not from a single blow, but from the accumulated pressure of multiple points, each one insufficient alone, together more than enough. They worked through the afternoon. By 3 o'clock they had the testimony of Warren Price written out in full and witnessed by Ruth. By 4 o'clock, 2 other men had come through the door, one summoned by a note Ruth sent with the button delivery boy who had run out earlier, one who had heard through the ordinary channels of a small town's afternoon and come in on his own. Both had dealings with Fitch. Both had paper they were willing to share. Both had been waiting in the way that people wait when they believe they are waiting alone for someone to stand up first. Jonas watched them come in and sit down and speak, and he thought about Warren Price turning his hat in his hands, and about the 4 people who had been in the same position and had stayed quiet because no one had asked them directly. He thought about the way a town could know something without knowing it could hold a collective understanding of a wrong thing, in the way a body holds a low-grade fever present and uncomfortable and not quite enough by itself to force a resolution. And he thought about himself on his porch at 5 in the morning with cold coffee and the sound of shouting across the pasture, and understood that what he had been for 10 years was not an exception to the way Caldwell worked, but a representative of it, a single instance of the larger phenomenon of people who knew and were afraid and had decided that the knowing and the fear together added up to something that excused the not acting. He had been wrong about that arithmetic for a long time. The receipt was delivered to the county office at 4:30, along with the written testimonies of Warren Price and the 2 other ranchers carried by Ruth herself, who walked down Main Street with a flat leather satchel under her arm and the expression of a woman conducting ordinary business, which was the same expression she used for everything and which, in this context, was the most effective disguise available. She returned at 5 with word from Holt. "He's cooperating," she said. She sat down. She poured herself tea from the pot that had gone cold an hour earlier and drank it without comment. He gave a full statement this afternoon. His own statement about what he did in 1874 and what Fitch paid him. She looked at her cup. His deputy is handling the office while Holt is occupied. Young man named Cutter. Seems reliable. "What about Harlan?" Jonas said. "Holt sent a man to the Voss place," Ruth said. "Harlan was there. He's not under arrest. The situation with Harlan is complicated because most of what he did was legal in form, even if not in spirit, but Holt told him directly that any attempt to enforce the arrangement with Fitch would be considered obstruction of an ongoing proceeding." She paused. "Harlan apparently sat down in a chair and stayed there. Didn't argue, didn't threaten, just sat down." Nora received this information without visible reaction. Ruth looked at her. "That doesn't fix anything," Ruth said quietly. "I want you to know I'm not telling you that as if it fixes anything." "I know," Nora said. I'm not expecting it to fix anything." The bell above the door rang. Jonas looked up. It was Clement Fitch. He was alone, which was wrong, and he was carrying his hat rather than wearing it, which was also wrong, the kinds of small physical details that register before the mind has fully processed what it is looking at. He closed the door behind him and stood inside the shop and looked at the room with an expression that was different from anything Jonas had seen on his face earlier in the day. The composure was still there, the architecture of it, but something underneath had shifted the way a building can look unchanged from the outside while the foundation has moved. Jonas was on his feet before he had decided to stand. "You were in custody," he said. "I was released," Fitch said, "pending the circuit judge's review. My lawyer arrived from Wichita at 4 o'clock. He looked at Jonas. Not at Nora, not at Ruth. At Jonas. "I have come to speak to you." "Then speak," Jonas said. Fitch came to the table. He did not sit. He stood at the end of it, and he placed his hat on the surface in front of him, and he looked at it for a moment, and then he looked up at Jonas with the particular expression of a man who has made a calculation and arrived at a number that is worse than he expected, and has decided that acknowledging this is more useful than pretending otherwise. "You know what you've started," he said. "Yes," Jonas said. "The circuit judge will hear this within the week," Fitch said. "My lawyer is skilled, and the documentation you have is limited. The receipt is genuine. I won't insult you by pretending otherwise, but its legal weight in a proceeding where I have 15 years of legitimate business in this county operating as counterweight is not as decisive as you may believe." "We have more than the receipt," Jonas said. Something moved through Fitch's expression, careful and controlled but present. "Price," he said. It was not quite a question. "Among others," Jonas said. Fitch was quiet for a moment. He looked at the table. He looked at the tin box still sitting open with Clara's 3 penciled lines visible inside the lid. He looked at it for a long time with an expression that was for the first time that Jonas had observed it not purely calculating. "She kept that all these years," he said. It came out quieter than the rest of what he had said, with less of the practiced control. "My mother kept it," Nora said. "She understood what it was for." Fitch looked at her. He looked at her the way he had not looked at her earlier in the day, not with the evaluative assessment of a transaction, but with something that was harder to categorize, something that might, in a different man, in a different context, have been called the beginning of recognition. "I am prepared to offer a settlement," Fitch said. He turned back to Jonas. "Full release of Harlan Voss's debt. Return of the land documents to the Voss estate. I will withdraw from any arrangement pertaining to Nora entirely." He paused. "In exchange for the withdrawal of the testimonies you have gathered and the return of the receipt." The shop was very quiet. Jonas looked at Fitch for a long moment. He looked at the 65-year-old man standing at the end of Ruth Abernathy's work table, with his hat in front of him, and his composure held together by the last of whatever it was made of, and he felt something that was not quite pity and not quite contempt, but existed somewhere between them. The feeling you have looking at something that was once impressive and has been reduced. "No," Jonas said. Fitch looked at him. "The offer is fair by any reasonable measure," Fitch said. His voice was still level. "The girl gets the land back. The debt is cleared. You have what you came for." "What I came for this morning," Jonas said, "was to stand between a young woman and the people who intended to use her. That part is done. What we're doing now is different." He looked at Fitch steadily. 15 years, Clement. 4 men I know of, probably more I don't. The Voss family. Clara working her land for 20 years and losing it in an afternoon because you purchased the outcome of the hearing ahead of time." He shook his head slightly. "You don't settle that with a private agreement in a dress shop on a Tuesday afternoon." Fitch looked at him for a long time. The last of the composure was still there, but it was very thin now, thin enough to see through clearly. "You understand what happens to you in this proceeding," Fitch said. "Your own testimony from 1874 is part of the record. Whatever you think you're accomplishing, you will stand in front of that judge and answer for what you said in that courtroom." "Yes," Jonas said. "I know." "Your reputation in this county." "I know." Your contracts. You're standing at the stockyard." "I know Clement," Jonas said. He said it without anger and without drama and without the smallest degree of uncertainty, the voice of a man who has done his accounting and accepted the total. "I know all of it. I have known it since this morning. It doesn't change anything." Holt had not left the room. He stood near the far wall watching the way a man stands when he is waiting to see which direction the last card falls. Fitch looked at him for a long time. Something moved through his expression that had not been there before. Not calculation, not composure, but a simpler and older thing. The look of a man who has run out of moves and knows it and has not yet decided what to do with that knowledge. He reached inside his coat. What he drew out was small, a short-barreled pistol, of the kind a man carries not for threat, but for conclusion, the kind that does not announce itself. He did not point it at Jonas. He pointed it at Nora, and when he spoke his voice had lost every quality that had made it useful to him across 65 years of careful management. "The land transfers when she signs," he said, "or when she no longer can." The shop door opened. Boyd Voss came in. No one had called him. No one had known he was still outside, standing on the boardwalk in the September afternoon, in the particular suspension of a man who has left a room but has not yet decided where he is going. He had been there for some time, it turned out, long enough to understand from the voices through the door what kind of moment was arriving. He looked at the gun. He looked at Nora. He crossed the room and stood between them. He did not say anything heroic. He did not make a speech. He was not a man who had speeches available to him. He simply stood in the space between Clement Fitch and his stepsister and put his body there, which was the most direct thing he had done in 28 years of taking the easier path whenever one was offered. "She's my sister," Boyd said. His voice was rough and not entirely steady. "Whatever else I am, she's my sister." Fitch looked at the obstacle in front of him with the eyes of a man doing arithmetic on an outcome that was no longer adding up correctly. Jonas was already moving. Ruth had gone very still in the particular way of a person locating something within arm's reach. And Sheriff George Holt, who had spent 10 years making the wrong calculations, made the right one now without hesitating. He crossed the room and took the gun from Fitch's hand. Fitch let it go. He stood there without it, and he looked smaller, the way things look smaller when the thing that was making them large is removed. He looked at Boyd, and then at Nora, and then at nothing in particular, and Jonas watched him and thought that this was what 65 years of choosing the wrong thing finally looked like when there was nothing left to choose. Holt walked him to the door without ceremony. Boyd remained in the center of the room. He turned and looked at Nora. She looked back at him with the eyes she had used for him their entire lives, the eyes that held everything that had happened between them without flinching from any of it. He nodded once. She nodded back. He walked out. The circuit judge arrived on Thursday. His name was Arthur Hamill, not Alderman, and Jonas learned from Ruth on Wednesday evening that Alderman had retired in the spring and Hamill had been appointed to the bench in June, a fact that the Wichita lawyer who had arrived Monday afternoon had clearly not yet fully processed to his advantage. Hamill was 58 years old and had come up through the land commissioner's office in Topeka before his appointment, which meant he understood the mechanics of fraudulent property transfer in ways that a man who had spent his career in criminal proceedings might not. He was not a warm man. He was precise and methodical, and he asked questions that went exactly where they needed to go without detour, and he listened to the answers with the kind of attention that made people speak more carefully than they intended to. The hearing took 2 days. Jonas testified on the first day. He sat in the chair in the county meeting room that had been designated as the proceedings space, and he told the truth about October 1874 in the complete and unedited version, the version that included his own role in it without qualification or mitigation, the version that named his fear plainly and did not dress it up as anything more defensible than what it was. He watched Hamill's face while he spoke and could not read it, which was either a very good sign or a very bad one, and decided to treat it as neither and simply continue. Fitch's lawyer from Wichita, a lean, precise man named Albright, who wore his suits like a second skin, and spoke in sentences that were structurally immaculate, cross-examined Jonas for 40 minutes. He was skilled, and Jonas had not expected otherwise. He worked the inconsistencies in Jonas's account, the places where the passage of 10 years had blurred the edges of specific conversations and specific words, and he worked Jonas's credibility with the careful relentlessness of a craftsman working a piece of material that has weaknesses he has identified in advance. Jonas answered every question directly, and did not try to improve his position, and did not attempt to present himself as something other than what he had been. When Albright asked why the court should give weight to the testimony of a man who had lied under oath in the very proceeding under review, Jonas said without hesitation that it shouldn't not on its own, and that it was not offered on its own, but as one piece of a larger picture, and that the larger picture did not depend on Jonas Reed's credibility, but on documents, and on the testimony of men whose dealings with Clement Fitch had no relationship to Jonas Reed's situation in 1874. Hamill looked at Jonas when he said this with the first expression that was fully readable since the proceedings began. It was, Jonas thought, the expression of a man who has heard the answer he was listening for. George Holt testified on the afternoon of the first day. He sat in the same chair Jonas had sat in, and he spoke for 2 hours in a voice that was quieter than his public voice, and more particular, a man giving a specific account of specific events with the care of someone who understands that precision matters more than presentation when the record you are building is the one you will have to live with. He named the amount Fitch had paid him. He named the date. He described the conversation in which the arrangement had been made. He described the conversation in which Fitch had demonstrated knowledge of his wife's illness and the Wichita doctor's fee in a way that made the nature of the offer unmistakable. Albright cross-examined him for an hour and a half. He was harder on Holt than he had been on Jonas, which was the right tactical decision from his perspective because Holt's testimony was more damaging and more specific. But Holt had the particular steadiness of a man who has decided to tell the truth in its entirety and has nothing left to protect, which made the cross-examination feel after a certain point like a man pushing against a wall. Warren Price testified on the morning of the second day. After him came 2 of the other ranchers. Their testimony built the pattern that Jonas had described to Ruth, the same lone structure repeated across multiple accounts, the same terms that were reasonable on the surface and unworkable in practice, the same sequence of default and acquisition that had run like a thread through Ford County land transactions for the better part of 15 years. Nora testified last. She had been in the room for all of it, sitting in the row of chairs along the wall with her back straight and her hands in her lap, and Jonas had watched her from the witness chair when it was his turn, and from the chairs when it was not watched, her receive each piece of testimony with the careful stillness of a person sorting information into a picture they have been building for a long time and are finally piece by piece able to complete. When she sat in the witness chair, she looked at Judge Hamill without nervousness and without performance, and she told him about her mother in the particular way that a person tells the story of someone they loved who is no longer present to tell it themselves, with a carefulness that comes from understanding that these are the words that will stand in place of the person and need to be accurate. She told him about the journal in the floorboard, about finding the receipt, about the 3 lines her mother had written inside the tin box lid. She told him about Monday morning and the storage room and the walk to Jonas Reed's gate along the Cimarron Creek bottom in the dark before sunrise. She was precise about everything, dates and words and sequences, and Albright's cross-examination found nothing to work with because there was nothing to find. The testimony of a person who is simply reporting what happened has a quality that is resistant to the tools designed for use against more constructed accounts. When she was finished, Hamill thanked her, and she returned to her seat, and Jonas looked at her, and she looked at him, and something passed between them in that look that was too quiet and too specific to be called anything grand, just the recognition of 2 people who had been through something together that had cost them both something real. Judge Hamill's ruling came on Friday morning. He found sufficient grounds to refer criminal charges against Clement Fitch to the district court in Wichita on 3 counts: corruption of a public official, fraudulent inducement in a legal proceeding, and a 3rd count related to the structured loan practices that Price and the other ranchers had documented. He found the 1874 land hearing in the matter of Voss versus the county recorder to have been conducted under materially compromised conditions and ordered a review of its findings by a qualified land commissioner. He looked at Jonas when he said this last part. The review of the 1874 hearing and his expression was the precise and methodical expression of a man doing his job. But underneath it, Jonas saw something that he chose to receive as what it appeared to be, which was an acknowledgment that the man sitting across from him had done something that needed doing even if it had come 10 years late. Regarding George Holt, Hamill noted his full cooperation and his voluntary testimony and his surrender of the receipt as material evidence and indicated that these factors would be considered in any proceeding related to his conduct. He did not clear him. He did not pronounce on his guilt or innocence in the venue of this hearing. What he did was create a record in which George Holt's cooperation was formally documented, which was the most that Jonas had hoped for, and perhaps more than Holt had expected. Holt was outside the building when Jonas came out. He was standing on the steps in the afternoon light with his hat in his hands, which seemed to be what men did in Caldwell when the formal part of things was over and the part that had no procedural structure had begun. Jonas stood beside him. They looked at the street for a moment. "What happens to you now?" Jonas said. "Don't know yet," Holt said. "Deputy Cutter has been handling the office well. Town will have to decide what it wants to do about the position." He paused. "I think I've decided what I want to do, which is not fight whatever the town decides. I'll give a full accounting of myself to whoever is appointed to look at it, and I'll accept whatever they determine is appropriate." He turned his hat once. "That feels like the right way to end it." Jonas nodded. "You did a hard thing in there," Holt said. "So did you," Jonas said. Holt put his hat back on and walked down the steps and into the street, and Jonas watched him go and thought about the 10 years they had both spent with the same weight and the different ways they had carried it and the different things it had cost each of them. And he thought that the distance between a coward and a man who had done a cowardly thing was not as large as it sometimes appeared from the outside, and that the direction a man moved from where he stood was more definitive than the place he was standing when you found him. He was still on the steps when Nora came out. She stopped beside him. They stood in the afternoon light of Caldwell's Main Street, the ordinary Friday afternoon traffic of a cattle town moving past them, the grain elevator at the north end of the street standing against the pale sky, the smell of the stockyard faint and familiar on the south wind. "The Land Commissioner review," she said. "How long does that take?" "Months, probably," Jonas said. "The courts move at their own speed. But it will happen." "It will happen," he said. "Hamill put it in the order. It will happen." She was quiet for a moment. "Ruth says I can stay with her while it's being sorted," she said. "She has the room and she says she's been meaning to take on help in the shop for 2 years." "That's Ruth," Jonas said. "She also says," Nora continued, and her voice shifted slightly, becoming more careful, "that you're going to have a difficult time at the stockyard for a while, that some of the men there won't be easy about your part in bringing down a man they did business with." "Probably," Jonas said. "Does that worry you?" He considered the question honestly. Standing on the steps of the Ford County meeting room in the afternoon of a September Friday, he held the question up to the light and looked at it from the angles available. "Not the way it would have a week ago," he said. She looked at him with the careful brown eyes that were her mother's eyes, and he was aware of this, fully, and without the guilt that had accompanied the awareness all day Monday. When she first appeared at his gate, the guilt was still present, but it was no longer the loudest thing in the room. "My mother was right about you," Nora said. "She was right that you had a conscience. She was just also right that you hadn't always been brave enough to act on it." "She was right about both," Jonas said. "She was usually right," Nora said. There was something in her voice when she said it that was not grief exactly, or not only grief but the kind of love that has survived the absence of its object and continued to exist in the form of clear-eyed knowledge of the person. She had a way of seeing what a person was capable of before they could see it themselves. They stood on the steps for another moment. Then Nora said in the tone of a person shifting from one kind of conversation to another, the tone of someone who has decided that the weight of the previous subject has been given its appropriate time and that practical matters now deserve equal consideration. Ruth says the east section of my mother's land has a fence line that's been badly maintained for years, that the posts are rotting and the wire is down in 3 places. Jonas looked at her. She also says, Nora continued looking at the street with the same composure she brought to everything, that you know that land better than anyone in Ford County since you helped run the original survey with my grandfather 30 years ago. 27 years ago, Jonas said. Your grandfather was very particular about the chain measurements. Wouldn't let me hold the far end because he said I pulled it crooked. Something happened to Nora's face that had not happened at any point in the 4 days Jonas had known her. Something light and unguarded, the expression of a young woman who is for this moment not managing a situation or holding herself in careful check, but simply reacting to something that struck her as genuinely worth smiling about. It was brief and it was real, and Jonas felt something in his chest ease in a way that was different from any of the other easings of the day. I'm going to need help with those fences, she said. Jonas looked at the September afternoon, at the pale sky above the grain elevator, at the long shadows of the buildings stretching across the hard-packed dirt of Main Street, at the ordinary working life of a Ford County cattle town, moving around them uninterrupted and continuous, the life that had been here before this week and would be here after it, carrying forward, as life does with the particular indifference to individual crisis, that is either its most frustrating or most reassuring quality, depending on where you are standing when you consider it. I know a thing or two about fixing fences, he said. 3 weeks later, on the first genuinely cool morning of October, Jonas rode out to what was coming to be called the Callaway section, the east pasture land that the Land Commissioner's preliminary review had already determined was improperly transferred in 1874, pending the full ruling that would come in November, but whose outcome the Commissioner had indicated in careful official language was not reasonably in doubt. Nora was already there when he arrived. She had a fence post digger and a coil of new wire and the kind of early morning energy that belongs to a person who has somewhere specific to be and a specific reason to be there. She had been staying with Ruth for 3 weeks, and Ruth had reported to Jonas in her characteristic factual way that Nora was quick with numbers, had reorganized the shop's inventory system in her first week in a way that Ruth admitted was better than the previous arrangement, and had taken to the work with a focus and a reliability that Ruth described as exactly what you would expect from Clara Voss's daughter. The fence line ran along the eastern edge of the pasture where it met a dry creek bed, the same creek that had been the boundary marker when Jonas and Nora's grandfather had run the original survey in 1857. The posts were as bad as Ruth had said, several of them tilted at angles that suggested years of neglect, the wire between them slack and rusted in several sections and absent entirely in 3. Jonas tied his horse and unloaded the post digger he had brought from his own barn. They worked through the morning without a great deal of conversation, which suited the work and suited them both. The rhythm of fence repair had its own pace and its own demands, the hard physical work of pulling old posts and setting new ones, the wire stretching taut between them, the particular satisfaction of a crooked line becoming straight. Jonas had done this kind of work for 35 years, and he did it now with the same steady efficiency he brought to it every time, and he was aware, working beside Nora, of the particular quality of working alongside someone who approaches physical labor with genuine attention rather than mere willingness. Around mid-morning they stopped to rest. They sat on the tailgate of the supply wagon Jonas had brought and drank water from the canteen and looked at the section of fence they had replaced, 4 new posts standing straight in the October ground, the wire between them clean and taut and correctly tensioned. The Commissioner will have the full ruling in November, Jonas said. Ruth said the same thing yesterday, Nora said. She looked at the fence. I keep expecting to feel more uncertain about it than I do. What do you feel instead? She considered this with the care she brought to everything. Like it's going to be what it's going to be, she said. I've been watching people manage uncertainty my whole life. My mother managed it for 20 years after losing this land. She never seemed to stop believing it would come right eventually. She paused. I think I inherited that from her. The believing. Jonas looked at the pasture land around them, the September grass browning toward its winter color, the dry creek bed catching the morning light in small, broken flashes of reflection, the sky enormous and pale above it all in the particular way of Kansas sky that always seemed to him to be the most honest thing in the landscape, too big to be anything other than what it was. She left you a good inheritance, he said. She left me this land, Nora said, and a journal, and a tin box. She looked at him sideways. And Jonas Reed's name. He was quiet for a moment. I have been thinking, he said, about what you told me she wrote. About me having a conscience but not always being brave enough to act on it. Yes. She wrote that in the journal 7 years ago, 8 years after 1874. Yes. She still believed it then, he said. After everything. She did, Nora said simply. Jonas looked at the fence line, at the 4 new posts standing straight in the October ground, at the work that had been done that morning and the work that remained to be done in the afternoon and the further work that would be there after that, because a fence line on a working ranch was never fully finished. It was only more finished than it had been, each post and each wire a small forward increment in an ongoing project. Your grandfather pulled the chain crooked too, he said. The first time we ran this line, he was just too proud to admit it, so he blamed me. Nora looked at him. You're saying the original survey was inaccurate, she said. I'm saying we ran it twice, Jonas said. The second time came out straight. She was quiet for a moment. Then the same thing happened to her face that had happened on the steps in Caldwell 3 weeks ago, that brief, unguarded lightness, and this time it lasted a little longer. We should probably check the original markers, she said. Probably, Jonas said. He stood up from the tailgate and picked up the post digger. Eastern corner first, he said. The markers your grandfather set are probably still there. He used cedar posts for the corners, not pine. Cedar holds. She stood and picked up the coil of wire. They went back to work. The October morning moved around them in its slow and indifferent way, the sun tracking its low arc across the pale Kansas sky, the dry grass moving in the occasional south breeze, the creek bed glinting and going dark in the alternating light and shadow. The sound of the post digger going into the ground made its clean, repeated rhythm across the pasture. The wire ran straight and taut between the new posts. In the weeks that followed, the Circuit Court in Wichita issued its preliminary findings in the matter of the state versus Clement Fitch. 2 of the 3 counts sustained the third under continued review. Fitch's lawyer from Wichita filed the expected challenges which the court received and noted, and began the expected process of working through the process that would take another full year to reach its conclusion and would end when it did with Fitch's permanent removal from any position of legal authority in Ford County and the formal dissolution of the loan structures that had operated across the county for 15 years. The land commissioner issued the full ruling on the 1874 Voss hearing in late November, 23 days before the first snow of the season. The ruling found the original proceeding materially compromised and its findings unsupported, and entered a corrected determination transferring the Callaway section to its lawful heir. The document was delivered to Ruth Abernathy's shop on a Wednesday afternoon, the kind of cold gray November day that made the lamplight inside the shop particularly warm by contrast. In the weeks between the hearing and the ruling, Caldwell settled into its new shape the way a town does after something large has shifted, not all at once, not cleanly, but in the steady, incremental way of things that have no choice but to continue. Harlan Voss left before the first frost. He sold the undisputed section of the Voss property to Warren Price at a price that reflected haste more than value, the kind of transaction a man makes when speed matters more than fairness, which is a different calculation from the one Harlan had been making for 11 years, but not an unfamiliar one. Nobody saw him go. His absence was simply noted one morning, the way an old post is noted when it has finally come down as something that had been there and was no longer there, the ground where it stood already beginning to settle. Boyd stayed. This surprised some people and did not surprise others. He hired on at the price operation for the winter working cattle and fence line and the ordinary hard labor of a ranch in the cold months. He did not speak about September, and no one asked him directly which was the Ford County way of extending a form of grace that did not require anyone to name it as such. He was working, and he was there, and whatever he was working through in the way men in that county worked through most things with his hands and with time, and without an audience. Ruth accepted it from the commissioner's deputy and signed the receipt and waited until the deputy left before she called Nora from the back room. Nora read it at the work table, standing still wearing her work apron. She read it once, and then she read it again, and then she set it down and placed both hands flat on the table beside it, and Ruth stood across from her and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said, and the lamp made its warm light across the work table and the fabric bolts on their shelves and the tin box that still sat in its place on the second shelf with Clara's 3 penciled lines visible whenever the lid was open. Jonas came by the following afternoon with a load of winter supplies he did not particularly need. He tied his horse at the post outside and came in, and Ruth was at the cutting table with her scissors, and Nora was at the work table with the account books, and the shop smelled of cedar and fabric and the particular kind of ordered peace that accumulates in a space where good work has been done over a long time. Nora looked up from the account books. "The ruling came," she said. "I heard," he said. She looked at him steadily with the eyes that were her mother's eyes, clear and particular and not given to embellishment. "Thank you," she said. He shook his head slightly. "You did the work." "We did the work," she said. She returned to the account books without ceremony because she was the kind of person who said what needed to be said and then moved to the next thing, which was Jonas had come to understand among her most reliable qualities. "The east fence line needs checking before the hard frost comes," she said without looking up. "I was thinking Saturday morning if the weather holds." "Weather should hold through Sunday," Jonas said. "Saturday then," she said. He set the supplies on the counter. Ruth looked at him from the cutting table with the expression she used when she was aware of something she had decided not to comment on, an expression that managed to be both entirely neutral and perfectly legible. He went back to his horse. The November afternoon was cold and clean, the sky a flat pale gray from horizon to horizon, the kind of sky that preceded snow by a few days and made the land below it look more itself. All the summer softness gone, the grass and the creek and the buildings standing in their actual shapes without the haze of heat to blur them. Jonas untied his horse and stood for a moment with the reins in his hand looking down Main Street toward the south end of town and the road that ran out past the stockyard and into the open land beyond the land he had worked for 30 years. The fence lines and pastures and creek bottoms and the long straight horizon of the Kansas plain that had been the frame of his life as far back as he could meaningfully remember. He thought about 10 years of cold coffee on a porch in the early morning. He thought about the sound of shouting across a pasture and the decision to go back inside. He thought about the weight below his ribs that had been so familiar for so long that he had stopped being able to imagine himself without it. He thought about a young woman standing at his gate before sunrise with a straight spine and her mother's eyes and the particular courage of a person who has decided they are done being afraid of the thing that has been frightening them. The weight was still there. He did not expect it to be otherwise. Certain things did not leave a man entirely regardless of what he did to address them. They only became things that had been addressed rather than things that had merely been carried, which was different, which was better, which was enough. He mounted his horse. He rode south down Main Street and out past the stockyard and into the open land of Ford County, Kansas on a November afternoon with snow 3 days out and the east fence line needing checking on Saturday and work enough ahead of him to occupy the foreseeable future. The road ran straight and pale across the brown winter grass. He kept his pace ordinary. It was enough.